and welcome to Murder with Friends, the show where two friends get together and talk about the darker sides of history. I'm your host, Grace Baldridge, and I'm actually going to be going out of town starting tonight. I'll be in South Dakota and North Carolina for a comedy festival, but Amir and I still wanted to make sure you guys had some new content from Murder with Friends. So Amir has joined me today in the Murder with Friends studio, and we're talking about a case, really a series of events in American history that we've been fascinated for a while, and we really wanted to cover. Initially, I wasn't sure if it qualified as a murder, but doing some digging, it definitely does.
There's some murder in there, yeah.
About the Donner Party.
Yes.
And I don't know if you guys have any familiarity with what the Donner Party is. It was a part of history that took place during westward expansion. Amir, can you explain to someone who has never heard about the Donner Party before a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today?
So they were amongst the hundreds of thousands of people that were going to the West in the 1840s and beyond as part of Manifest Destiny. So they were a party of around, in total, I think, they reached a party of about 90 people with around like 80-something wagons. And while most people took the Oregon Trail to get to the West, they decided to take another route.
And what these people were looking for was opportunity. They were looking for a better life. These were people that gave up everything to try and find their destiny out west, this uncharted territory. And that brings us just to our first clip to explain a little bit about the time period with which the Donner Party took place. Let's take a look.
Some walk 16 kilometers a day for up to 6 months, going through 10 pairs of boots on the journey. Half are children, 1 in 5 of the women are pregnant. Families sell farms, saving for an average of 5 years to join the exodus, risking everything.
I think if there is one episode that encapsulates the American spirit, I think it is probably the move west. Whip those mules and horses and cross those rivers and cross over those mountains to the unknown and say, I'm leaving everything behind. I'm leaving everything that I know behind to reinvent myself.
Something that Amir and I point out when we were watching that clip was a lot of the clothing that they are wearing on this journey is what we would consider now sort of dress clothing. It wasn't like they were doing this journey in their best athleisure wear.
Like vests and
like boots made
slacks.
out of, like hard leather, and wood boots. I mean, these weren't the ideal sort of materials. They were working with the best of what they had.
And they would walk thousands of miles without any foot support in those goddamn boots.
Yeah, so it's 1846, and the Donner Party, which you said about 90 people, they set off from Springfield, Illinois, and they are headed west, really with the destination being California, but where in California sort of was yet to be determined.
Yeah, it was mostly Northern California at this point because there was still the Mexican-American War going on, and people were really uncertain about the territory in Southern California. Yeah,
so it was Northern California, and then also there was the promise of maybe gold and discovery out in Oregon and California. They were led by brothers Jacob and George Donner. And the crucial mistake that comes with the Donner Party and comes very early on in their story is the decision, instead of taking the road most traveled, they decided to pull a Robert Frost and take the road less traveled. And they took what was recommended by Lansford Hastings, who was a 27-year-old lawyer with a very grandiose vision for his future. He thought that maybe he would rule what would become a Californian republic. And he was the trail guide traveling a little bit ahead of them. He published a book sort of saying that it was the emigrant's guide to Oregon and California. And in this book, he says, quote, the most direct path would be to leave the Oregon route about 200 miles east of Fort Hall, thence bearing west-southwest to the Salt Lake, and thence continuing down to the Bay of San Francisco. He's saying that there's this cutoff that you could take.
And on
However,
paper,
he hadn't even done it yet.
Yeah.
This guy wrote this book, and he sort of said you could try it, but he didn't even know it was to expect.
And on top of that, the parts that he did try was just by himself on horseback. It wasn't really meant for an entire party of wagons to even try this.
Yeah.
And look, on paper, it looks like a more direct route, and you can see it in the map that we're showing right now. But on top of them taking this cutoff, another important thing to remember is that they started their westward expansion at the latest possible time that you should do it. So they had very little margin of error to get to California before winter hit.
Yeah, because
they left in May, I believe, and you're supposed to leave way earlier than that.
They left in the spring. I believe they left
End of spring.
Yeah, in like the end of April is when they set off on the road. They had very little margin for error, and it was one of the biggest risks you could take at that time. We were discussing, there was a 70-year-old, she was the mother-in-law to
the Reed family.
To the Reed family, who knew that this would probably be the final journey of her life.
Yeah, she had TB, she was 70 years old, she was part of this huge family of people moving to the West, and that kind of goes to show what the stakes were for these people, and they were willing to go do it.
Well, and also what it brings up is that when we talk about the Donner Party, some people think that it was just a family of Donners, but it was many, many families. The main characters that we'll be talking about today are the Breens, Kesebergs, the Stanton, who came back, the Reeds, the Graveses, and Murphys, and then also the Donner family as well.
So it started out as a smaller party, and this happened quite commonly while people were moving to the West. Along the trail, other people would join in because it was safer to go with a group of people. And by safer, I mean because you have more support system, you have more resources, and Native Americans are less likely to attack you if you're in a big group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they would travel together in these big teams, but this group of this party decided that they would not take the Oregon path, and instead they would take Hastings Pass, which was really the crucial and the fateful decision for them. It's also just such a human desire. Like, I want to take the faster route, and I want to get there faster, and I know better, and everyone else is doing that, but I want to go my own way.
Yeah, and according to Hastings, whose cutoff this is, he claimed that it would save them 350 miles. And because they were leaving so late to begin with, that sounded like a great deal to them.
Yeah. So they make it through the Wasatch Mountains, and they arrive at the Great Salt Lake Desert. And the route that they have now taken, Lansford's route, has taken them about 18 to a month days. So they're already their supplies are depleting. It is not the easy path that they thought it would be. But once they get to the Great Salt Lake Desert, they think, okay, well, maybe the worst is behind us. And they elect to have James Reed, who is a character that we'll see more and more in this story, sort of pilot the expedition. But the desert is really, what bugs me about this story is that I feel for them so strongly, because you hear in their letters, and there's a really awesome website that I'll toss up a link below, where you can see all their diary entries of people that were within one of the parties or knew someone in the parties. They think that the worst is behind them, so that once they make it through the mountains, they think, okay, the worst is behind us, and now we just have to cross the Salt Lake Desert, and then we'll be, I think it was within like 150 miles of getting to what is it, Fort Sutter?
Yeah,
Sutter's
Fort Sutter in California. So to go back a little bit. There was actually some conflict in the party between George Donner, the head of the Donner family, and James Reed, the head of the Reed family, who they were both vying to be the leader. And George Donner was actually the more favored of the two because, according to some of them, Reed was very autocratic in his leadership. Even though he was a military man, he was from America, they didn't like him as much. He wasn't a very likable character.
Some people described him as a little bit aloof, sort of smug, felt like he was a little bit better than other people, described as pompous.
So while they were trying to make these decisions on the way to the cutoff, it was Reed that actually kept pushing them to take this cutoff because he thought, wow, shortcut, this sounds great, even though everyone else was a little bit wary of doing this, because some of the women were the ones that were thinking that Hastings was not a really reputable character to begin with.
Because he was 27 years old and he had no idea what he was talking. No one had any idea what they were talking about when it came to the West.
And another interesting tidbit, this journalist by the name of Bryant, he actually got to the break between where the cutoff starts a week ahead of the Donner Party. And he went to check out the Hastings cutoff, and he realized that it's complete shit for a huge wagon party like the Donner Party.
So he got to the fork in the road, and he decided that he was going to explore Hastings Cutoff because it was being published, and therefore, even though people have said he wasn't recommending it, it's still, if you're publishing it in your book, you're saying that people could try it. He took the cutoff a little ways and realized it wasn't it wasn't what he said it was going to
So
be.
he went back to the fort that's at the beginning of the cutoff, and he left letters warning them not to take this cutoff, this shortcut. However, the guy who ran that fort, it would be in his best interest to have people take the cutoff, because normally people wouldn't even go in that direction. They take the Oregon Trail.
So for his business,
so
he wanted people to take this terrible cutoff.
So he concealed the letters that this journalist left warning them.
Wow.
And we all know what happens next. We'll talk about it.
Yeah. So I guess now where we're picking up is the party has taken this cutoff, and it has really led them to some desperate times. And before we even get to the cannibalism, which I'm sure you guys are aware is coming if you know anything about the Donner Party, there's unrest within the group, and indeed a murder takes place. So let's go to a clip right now describing the first murder in the Donner Party.
On October 5th, the immigrants were doubling their teams up a steep sandy hill when the Graves family wagon became entangled with the Reed wagon. Tempers flared, and the Graves driver, John Snyder, began beating the oxen with the butt of his bullwhip. James Reed hurried over to stop it, but only enraged Snyder further, who struck him savagely on the head with his whip. Reed drew his hunting knife, and as Snyder raised his arm to strike again, drove it into the teamster's chest, just below the collarbone. Snyder staggered a few yards up the hill and died.
Mr. Reed and family were taken to their tent and guarded by their friends. An assembly was convened to decide what should be done. The majority declared the deed murder and demanded retribution.
So this is really when we start seeing a change within the party, because
the disintegration.
Yeah, so he's banished, and we'll tell you a little bit about what happens to James Reed after he's banished. But when they're banishing him, it's sort of a form of sentencing him to death, because they already knew that how much they were suffering. So his chances on his own were also really bad.
Yeah, and this was how it worked back then, because west of the Continental Divide, there was no legal system. There was no American law over there. So usually these different parties would have to come down with a verdict themselves.
Yeah, it was the Wild West, and that
on
was
top
their
of that,
justice system.
I mean, we talked about this earlier, that we felt that Reed was probably in every right to defend himself. And some people were saying not only was he being whipped, but his wife got whipped too when she came to try to defend him.
Yeah, no, it sounds like Graves had a major break from reality when he started beating the ox.
Yeah.
And just to put that into perspective, when they crossed the Great Salt Lake Desert, they lost 36 oxen.
Yeah.
And that was their way of transportation, but that also would become their food source. And so to go out of his way to beat an animal was really stupid, and that's why James Reed called him out. It wasn't just like, oh my God, I love the animals. It was like, are you kidding me? Like, this is our way of survival. You can't do this.
They were already dealing with a lot of hardships that they did not expect, nor were they prepared to do.
Yeah.
Like none of these people had any experience really in the wilderness, in hunting. There was very few of them that knew survival skills.
Yeah, some of them were good hunters, but what we'll see is that they weren't experienced fishermen, and their skills weren't on par with some of the mountain men that they came across, because I read a record where they came across sort of a mountain man who had also done Hastings Pass, and he said, you guys cannot do this with this big of a group that you have. You'll never get over there with the wagons. But nevertheless, with all these delays, they start to make their way over the Sierra Nevada mountains very, very late in the season. And this is where they start to split off, because a bunch of the families want to head over to Truckee Lake, and they're trying to make their way over the mountains. And then on the day that these families, these groups were making this decision, like, okay, we're gonna really go for it, we need to get to the summit of these mountains, we need to get over these mountains, George Donner slices his hand open trying to fix his wagon. So the Donner family, stay back at what is Alder Creek.
Yeah, about 6 miles further down from Truckee Lake.
Yeah, 6 miles from Truckee Lake, and Truckee Lake is about 150 miles from Sutter's Fort, which is where all the other immigrants who had gone from, wherever they were through the regular pathway were all meeting up. So they were only 150 miles
So
away
close,
when they were at
yeah.
Truckee Lake. And then you have the Donner Party at Alder Creek. And this is where shit hits the fan, because October 28th, there's a very heavy snowfall that
Way earlier than anticipated.
way earlier than anticipated, and it just sort of blocks them in. They're just trapped and stuck, and they have to make winter camp. They have to set up camp. There's no way for them to move forward. That has got to be so heart-wrenching to know that you're here for the next, 3 months.
Yeah, and at this point, I mean, they'd gone through the Wasatch Mountains, which was very difficult. They'd gone through the Great Salt Lake Desert, which they lost a ton of livestock. They were almost out of water. So by the time they got there, they were already kind of fucked. And they had lost so much of their supplies. They had lost so much of their energy and their hope. And now they're stuck here for a winter.
And now they set up a camp at Truckee Lake, and they sort of go back and forth to Alder Creek. Like, someone will send messages and give way. But really, what the plan is they're trying to, and they try for weeks, and they'll work up their strength and they'll save up. They try to get to Fort Sutter. Yeah. So that's where we're going to leave you for this part. We have the Donner Party and the other families left at Truckee Lake and Alder Creek. And when we come back, we're going to tell you about how they descended into murder and cannibalism, which made the Donner Party so infamous. We'll see you in part 2.